reading from the Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, "Take care of him. If you spend more than what I've given you, I shall repay you on my way back." Which of these 3, in your opinion, was the neighbor to the robber's victim? He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." These are the instructions given to us by our brother Jesus.
Praise to you, Jesus the Christ.
Have a seat. How many times have we read this parable and asked ourselves what we might do if we came across someone in desperate need of help? Maybe a stranded car, or someone who seemed lost or confused, someone who had just been a victim of a crime. I had an experience like that in Scotland recently, and I'm ashamed to admit that I failed the test. We were a little bit lost in Glasgow trying to find our way back to our hotel when we came across a young man sprawled out on a bench at a table outside of a cafe. His arms were dangling to the ground as if the kid had just laid back and fallen asleep. That he was completely still, and there was a dusky blue look around his mouth on his face. So my initial judgment was, well, he's a little unkempt, maybe a hitchhiker, a homeless person, maybe he was intoxicated or had overdosed. We walked a few steps past him, and then I felt the conviction of the Holy Spirit, this parable in my brain. He was somebody's son, and he was either dead or he was dying. But I didn't quite know how to help, and I was admittedly nervous and afraid of the situation, of what we might be getting into. But we did walk back in his direction just to see some people who were much braver than me run into the cafe to get the manager, who came out then and tried to wake him up. I could see the muscles twitch in his face. I thought, okay, he's alive. And then we didn't want to be gawkers. I wouldn't know how to call an ambulance in Scotland. So we continued on our way. But I felt a little like the priest or the Levite that day. Amy Jill Levine, who's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, says that the parables are written to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. They are intended to provoke or indict, and on that day this parable both provoked and indicted me. Our story begins with a man traveling down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem is to the Jews a symbolic place of spiritual transformation, the Mecca of Jewish identity. So the road from Jerusalem indicates a time post-transformation. In other words, symbolic of how we are to live after we have been changed. It is a message of discipleship. The story is prompted by a question about how we are to live, posed by a practitioner of the law. Now, Jesus knew the laws of his faith. He knew that the Torah taught that you should love your neighbor. You should love the stranger among you, because you were once a stranger in the land of Egypt. But this man wanted specifics. Who's a stranger? Who's my neighbor? What are those boundaries that separate us? The lines of distinction that I must cross to fulfill this commandment. Now, if I'm about to tell a story, I might start with sitting in a bar was a priest, a rabbi, and what would you say?
An imam.
Imam, right? Or if I were to say, sitting in the bar was the Father, the Son, and the
Holy Ghost.
Yeah, all right, you got it. It's a pattern of three, and it's a common pattern in Jewish teaching. So Jews at the time of this teaching knew that if you said a priest, a Levite, the third answer was an Israelite. That was their pattern of three that they were most accustomed to. But Jesus blew them away. Rather than the anticipated answer of Israelite, he painted a picture of a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. Samaritans weren't the oppressed people that time. They were the enemy to that audience that Jesus was addressing. They were despised people, thought of as the pariahs on society. At first glance, we see a lawyer asking, "Who's my neighbor?" And we see a Samaritan showing him how to be a good neighbor. Martin Luther King, in his homily on this parable, suggested that the Levite and the priest were afraid. They thought, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? They were surrounded by robbers on that road from Jerusalem. It was the Good Samaritan who asked, if I do not help this man, what will happen to him? To King, it was like asking, if I don't help the sanitation workers in Memphis, what will happen to them? For us, perhaps, if I don't stand with the farm workers or the slaughterhouse workers in Rantoul when ICE drives up, what will happen to them, to their families? And so we rally by the courthouse. We donate to political causes, but it isn't enough to donate to a worthy cause or post about it on Facebook. King says that it is pity that prompts us to write a check, and not the kind of love displayed by the Samaritan. The Samaritan got engaged. He got his hands bloodied. He cleansed and wrapped the wounds of a beaten man. He hoisted the man up on his donkey and led him to safety. He checked on his welfare and paid for his care. The road from Jerusalem asks us to put some skin in the game, to get our hands bloodied, to be compelled by what might happen to others if nobody stops to help them. In our first reading, Moses pleaded with the people to keep the commandments and statutes of the law, but to keep not only that which is written, but that which is written in our mouths and on our hearts. Do we have the law of love written in our hearts? King says man-made laws ensure justice, but a higher law produces love. No longer can we afford the luxury of passing by on the other side. Such a folly, says King, was once called a moral failure. Today it will lead to universal suicide. We cannot long survive spiritually separated in a world that is geographically together. And that's the message of the Good Samaritan, at least the lesson we have been taught over the years, isn't it? It's why we have named our hospitals after this courageous person, and why we have laws that protect good Samaritans from legal retribution if something goes wrong. But historian Amy Jill Levine says in the ancient past, this parable was not thought of as the parable of the Good Samaritan, but rather the parable of the man who fell among the robbers. She says those who were listening were led to consider themselves as the man in the ditch, not the man who did good. The shock that a rescuer was a Samaritan left them saying, I would rather die than admit that a member of that group helped me. The story gets to the heart of our prejudice and our pride. Cynthia Bourgeault, author of The Wisdom Jesus, says that what turns this story upside down is when the Jew, the chosen person, becomes the victim and the pariah becomes his rescuer. After two of his own kind had left him for dead. What Jesus is really asking here is, do you really know, as well as you think you do, what is good and what is bad? Who are the righteous and who are the not righteous? Bourgeault says this is a direct challenge to that binary operator in our brain, which is so quick to judge and feel self-meritorious. Despite the recent cruel and inhumane ICE roundups of Mexicans and other immigrants, other minorities who've been living in the U.S., it was members of Mexico's Civil Protection Water Rescue Team and CURE firefighters who traveled 145 miles to cross the border and join those who were helping with the search efforts in the flooded Texan hill country. Texas, a very red state, a state that has purged nearly 1,000 undocumented immigrants with ICE operations in Dallas, leading the efforts to charter flights filled with deported individuals to unknown destinations.
The state that used to belong to Mexico.
Yeah. And yet when Texan children were floating down the Guadalupe River to their peril, it was our neighbor to the south that came to help. I wonder what that was like for a MAGA Texan and a brown-faced Mexican man to look into the eyes of each other as they dug through the debris for survivors, as they depended on each other with the torrents of the river while they pulled drowning bodies out of the water. I've often heard people ask one another, if Donald Trump were lying on the side of the road injured, what would you do? You could take Donald Trump out of the equation, plug in, the person that is hardest for you to love. But here the real question is, if you were lying on the side of the road injured and Donald Trump came by to help, or some other person that you struggle to love, how would that be? Now I get it, there are some people I wouldn't trust, even on my deathbed, and he might be one of them. Sometimes we have to believe those kind of spidey senses that the person who is trying to help us will swindle us or kick us when we're down. It does happen. We'd be foolish to put blind faith in just anyone. But the message to us in the story, the man left by the side of the road, is that the face of our enemy is also in the image and likeness of God. I read an interesting tidbit this week. Don't know if it's true, but I thought it was fascinating. Did you know that if you put 100 black ants and 100 red ants in a jar, they'll get along just fine. Nothing will happen. But if you shake that jar hard, the ants will start killing each other. The red ants will consider the black ants their enemies. The black ants will consider the red ants their enemies. So before we look at another person in need and weigh our willingness to get involved or our openness to let them help us when we are the ones in need, let's give some thought about how we were conditioned to label them in the first place. Perhaps the real culprit is not the person lending a hand, but the one who is shaking the jar.